Hi, Jan.
Hi, nice to meet you.
How are you doing?
Excellent. How are you?
I'm fine. So we are talking online because you're in Massachusetts, right?
Yep, exactly.
And I'm in France. So happy Thanksgiving first.
Thank
How
you.
was it?
It was great. It was kind of low key this year, which was actually really nice. My wife and I stayed here and kind of made all the food that we love and didn't have to make too much of it, and it was a great day.
Nice. So today is Black Friday, but we won't be talking about it. I might go buy the plugin you just released, Basslane,
Yeah.
because I tried it a few days ago and I really enjoyed it. It really saved my life on a DJ set with really big phase issues. The other plugins I owned didn't sound as good, as punchy, and that was really what impressed me. I already was interested in the plugin, but when I tried it a few days ago, I was really impressed. So I'm really happy to have this interview with you,
Awesome.
because you are one of the persons who build it, right?
Yep, exactly. So I was a lot of kind of the conceptual ideas behind it. And then Rune from Tone Projects does all the coding and UI design and all that part of it. So yeah, but
Okay.
it's certainly a collaborative process over the last year and a bit.
And if I'm correct, it already existed in a freeware version?
Yeah, so there was a plugin called just Basslane that was, I think, one of the very first plugins that Rune, who runs Tone Projects, created, like maybe back in the early 2000s. And that was a fairly standard kind of low end mono maker, right? Basically like a high pass filter on the side channel, minimum phase, and so that existed and that had been out there. And I think Rune was already thinking about updating that. And then heard me talking about kind of some of my ideas around the subject, actually on a podcast episode with Ian Shepherd. And so Rune was interested in getting in touch with me. At the same time, I had been using Rune's other products, Unisum and Kelvin, and really enjoying them. And kind of on the strength of those, wanted to get in touch with him to see if we could develop this idea that I'd had for a few years. So it was very kind of serendipitous. We got in touch through a mutual contact, and it kind of went from there.
Okay, what's the concept that makes it unique? Like, what did you bring to the table?
Sure. So there are a couple things. One, and kind of the foundational one that, for me, came about probably 5 or 6 years ago, was the mono recovery part. There are a few plugins out there that kind of claim to be able to do this, but I kind of test them all periodically, and even recently retested some that I had pointed out problems about in the past, and they kind of still have the same problems. So the ability to take signals that are in antiphase or completely in the side channel and recover those back to mono. So, it's not, I don't want to say it's common, but it's not entirely uncommon with like synthesized basses to have like a lot of width added. And what'll happen is a lot of time when you mono them, they'll either drop in level a lot. Sometimes they'll disappear entirely. So that was one of the big things that we want to be able to do. And that was kind of a technique I figured out, again, like 5 or 6 years ago, a really pretty clean way to do that. So that was one of the things. The other thing, which was kind of this idea that came to me live on this podcast I did with Ian Shepherd, was the idea to do stereo widening with harmonics. So being able to add harmonics based on the original kind of bass signal, but then pan those in ways that either mimic the original positioning, or even if you're starting with a mono signal, can kind of artificially widen stuff. So those were kind of the two concepts that really off the bat, we both knew we want to include these. We want to make these the best that we can. And then some of the other kind of sections and parts and pieces around the plugin came together around those, as we realized, okay, we need more control here. We'd like to be able to do that there, whatnot.
Yeah, it's the concept. The new concept you brought is really interesting, but also all the little features like the pre, the delta, the side, the mono. It's really interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
And
And I think some of those we realized, as we were kind of iterating on the design, like the delta, for example. Okay, being able to hear that to fine tune some of the timing parameters or what have you is really useful. So it's more than just oh hey, here's what the plugin's doing in the background. We tried to make things that were really useful features.
yeah, in what situation would you use the width knob more than 100% in a mastering situation typically?
We've actually seen. So one of our beta testers, Bob Mack, who's a British mastering engineer, has been using it a lot because one of the things you can do is you can set the filter type to bandpass, and then the frequency range that you can set it to really it extends up to I think 2.5K. So you've got a large range in there. So there have been from a mastering perspective, we've certainly seen cases where maybe the bass actually gets over monoed in production and wanting to bring some of that back just via kind of a natural process rather than via adding the harmonics. So setting that to bandpass and just dialing a little bit kind of at the upper end of the bass range can be really nice to kind of enhance some of the width that's already there. In a production context, if you've got a sound that already has some width, but you want to push it a little bit, again, kind of maybe in the upper part of that range, but not really the very lower part. Again, you could use that bandpass. You could use the pre-filter to exclude that. So there definitely are applications, and actually, one of the things I think that's surprised me certainly a little bit is that people are gravitating towards the widening aspects of it, of what the plugin can do, which really was kind of the opposite end of where I was originally coming at it from. But that's kind of the great part of the life cycle of a product like this is seeing what people will do that you haven't thought of.
Yeah. I've used it as a bass monoing tool recently, and compared to other plugins, I found that some punch remained compared to other plugins. So is it just my brain tricking me, or is there a trick that you're using?
I hope it's not. Certainly, there are a few things compared to other plugins. So one is that we're using by default linear phase crossovers, and there's a phenomenon. Anytime you're doing mid-side kind of adjustments, if you're using EQ or filters or crossovers of any sort, the phase shift, if you're using minimum phase crossovers or filters, that phase shift has a big impact on positioning, and it will kind of smear stuff and can take away some of the impact and punch. So using those linear phase crossovers, I think that's a big part of it. Being able to, if you dial it all the way down to mono, arguably that's maybe not that much different than some other techniques that you could use. But if you start to bring in the mono recovery, that's going to help retain some of the level and punch that may have originally been kind of wider and out towards the edges. And that'll help kind of keep that present. Whereas if you're just using, kind of traditional filtering techniques, there's going to be a level difference between things that were panned and things that were centered. And you can kind of make some of that up with gain, but now you're changing the gain of things that were in the middle. So it becomes this kind of tightrope walk. So the mono recovery can definitely help with some of that kind of retaining punch. So I think, there's certainly good reason that between those two things, what you're hearing could have been very much a real thing and not just in your head.
Okay, thanks. Let's talk about linear phase. Doesn't linear phase bring pre-ringing?
Yes, it certainly does. And so that was one of the, honestly, I think probably the first thing that we really kind of worked on was getting those linear phase filters implemented and listening to them and making sure that the performance was, kind of up to spec for a mastering grade processor. So there are a couple factors that kind of really help here. First is that it is fairly high latency. The filters, it's about 4,000 samples, a little bit more of latency, which obviously, depending on your sample rate, that equates to a different amount of time. So having a higher window length, a longer filter, minimizes that pre-ringing. So that was part of it. The other part is that the way the crossover is constructed and coded, if everything is run through at unity gain, the pre-ringing from one side of the crossovers, so for example, the low side, actually cancels against the pre-ringing that's generated on the high side. So if you're running everything at unity, you actually get a completely, like, you'll get no change. A transient will pass through completely unchanged. It's as you start changing the gains that the pre-ringing could come up a little bit, but I have to say, in a year plus of using it, because again, those filters were really the first thing that we got nailed down, I've never had it be an audible issue. I'm certainly not going to claim that it's not there, and that with the right kind of signal you couldn't manipulate it in a way that you could observe it. But in real world use cases, I've never had it be audible. And then the other thing for me is that the kind of weird image warping artifacts that you get from minimum phase are much more audible and problematic and less desirable than any kind of minuscule amount of pre-ringing that you might get from the linear phase filters. So that's kind of the reasoning there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Could you tell us more about the stereo harmonics section?
Sure. So the stereo harmonics were kind of this idea that I had live on that podcast. And basically the idea is that there's this kind of well-known psychoacoustic principle, right? Where if you add harmonics to a very low frequency sound, your ear and your brain kind of interpret those harmonics as representing that fundamental bass frequency. So there have been, like Waves Max Bass is kind of probably the one that's been around the longest, right? That kind of does that. It adds some harmonics and kind of tricks your brain into hearing more low end. And so my thought was, well, okay, what if we do that, but we take the harmonics and pan them, either to represent the original position of the signal, or if you're starting with something that's just kind of predominantly in antiphase or in the side channel, just kind of has this weird artificial width to it, we could do something similar. And so by panning alternating harmonics in different directions, you can kind of retain or recreate some of that sense of width and positioning that gets lost when you just, mono. If you've got a very pure low frequency tone, if you just mono it, you kind of lose that, right? And there are lots of reasons you might want to mono the low end, but that you still want to retain some of that sense of kind of spaciousness or width or positioning, So the different modes in there kind of cater to different use cases, right? So side mode, so you've got the source selector, right, on the left. Side mode is going to drive those harmonics from the side channel. So if you've got stuff that's kind of panned or in antiphase and just kind of a general ambience thing, that might be a good mode. Stereo mode is actually dual mono. So it's generating harmonics on the right from stuff that was originally on the right, harmonics on the left from stuff that was originally on the left. So it's going to track the original position, which is kind of unique. And then mid is obviously stuff that's, more prominent down the center. It'll still get stuff that's panned, but it'll key more to things that are in the middle. So, if you want to add some apparent width to something that's already mono, you get a song and it's, again, that case where something's been over monoed a little bit and you want to add some width, you could use the mid source. And then one of the nice things is that depending on where you set the MS balance of the harmonics, if it's 50-50, so if it's straight up and down, that's basically equating to panning those harmonics hard left and hard right. And in that situation, they'll still be fully mono compatible. So you can create this sense of width, but then not lose the kind of tonality change that you get with that when it gets summed to mono. If you push it all the way to 100% side, now it's completely in the side channel, sound really super wide, but again, will kind of disappear in mono. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. What about the dampen knob?
Yeah, so the dampen knob, it's basically like a very gentle low pass filter, or maybe even kind of a shelf. So it just rolls off some of the upper end of those harmonics, so that, if you are adding harmonics, especially if you're using like the crunchy mode, which adds even higher order harmonics, it doesn't get too kind of bright or brittle, or so if you like some of the tonality that's doing down low, but it gets a little bright, you can kind of roll that down. But it's very gentle, so you can go really low with it and still not, get a drastic like low pass type sound to it. Just kind of slowly slopes off.
Okay. And what about the dynamics section?
Yeah, so the dynamics section was, I think, one of the last sections that we added, actually. And it really, part of it was wanting to make the tool, capable of doing some kind of general enhancement. Right. So the stereo mode is kind of it's like a nice low end beefer upper, right? It kind of does some just nice punchy low end glue type compression. But then the side mode was also really useful because we kind of had talked about early on, maybe if there's time, once we get, kind of everything else dialed in, being able to do some dynamic control of width elements would be really nice. So the side mode allows you to do that. And then having either compression or expansion really gives a lot of flexibility. So for example, in side mode, you could leave the main width control kind of at or near 0, but dial in some compression, and that's just going to move transients towards the center, right? It'll still kind of leave ambience and all of that in its original width, but any kind of transient stuff it'll pull towards the center. Conversely, if there's kind of like a lot of background ambience that is kind of wide and you want to just pull that in and tighten that up, but you want to keep the position of, for example, a panned low tom or something, you could dial the width down, but use expansion in side mode to push transients back out to their original position. So yeah, it's, again, we tried to make it a combination of kind of problem solving and just overall enhancement and better making, right? If you want to just kind of beef things up, if you're really happy with it already and you just want to get a little bit more out of the low end, we'd like to think there are tools in Basslane Pro that allow you to do that. Whereas, again, if you need to really fix something that's just comes in and it's, going to be technically problematic on a lot of playback systems, what have you, it's got the tools to do that too.
Well, I think we talked about every section. Maybe the sub filter. Did we talk about the sub filter?
Yeah, I think I touched on it briefly. The sub filter, again, there's a few different kind of modes in there that you can really utilize. One of the things early on for me was, okay, if you're doing mono recovery, there might be, maybe the signal that you want to kind of recover to mono starts at 40 hertz or 35 hertz or something and goes up to wherever. But there might be some stuff below it that is just kind of, some real low frequency hash that's out at the edges that you don't want to pull back into the center. So that was kind of the first use case, and that's where that side mode comes from. So you've got a side channel high pass just to kind of roll out anything real low before it gets recovered to mono. And then we kind of iterated from there. So again, there's we've decided, maybe it'd be nice to be able to put that at the end of the chain too. So there's the post button, so you can either have it at the very beginning or at the very end. Rune started playing around with the boost mode, which is, we describe it as a resonant high pass, which it is, but it's kind of more than that. The shape of that boost filter and the resonant bumps is very unique and frequency dependent too. So that can kind of give you, again, if you want to roll off some of the real low kind of junk, but then enhance some of the, fundamental of the kick or the bass or whatever, boost mode does that in a really nice musical way. So yeah, both kind of problem solving and enhancing options there as well. Stereo mode is just kind of your typical stereo high pass filter. Yeah.
And Yeah, because I thought it was really important to talk about, because people might use high pass on the side too much, like really too much, and it causes a lot of problems. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, so that's kind of one of those things I was mentioning at the beginning, right? If you just use a high pass on the side, and especially if it's minimum phase, if you get steeper than really 6 dB per octave, but certainly once you get to 18 or 24, the phase response of a minimum phase high pass filter on the side channel just does very weird things to the low frequency positioning. So it'll make it mono at the very bottom, but then as you approach that cutoff frequency, something that was originally on the right can actually end up on the left, and it'll kind of scramble and go back and forth. So that's one of the problems associated with it. The other is, even if you're using linear phase, yeah, a lot of times people either they set it much higher than it really needs to be, right? I think there's been kind of this folk wisdom that's gone around about vinyl, that if you're going to vinyl, it has to be mono below 300 hertz or something like that. And that's really not true.
Yeah.
Vinyl can actually handle a decent bit of stereo width in the low end. It tends to be dynamic width that's more problematic. And really, ultimately, it's, your best bet if you're dealing with something like that is going to be to work with a cutting engineer who knows their lathe and knows what they can get out of it. The other thing is that, using like a high pass on the side channel makes it this kind of binary choice, right? Either it's mono or it's, somewhere in that slope region. Whereas with Basslane Pro, you can go anywhere from 0%, which is mono, to 250%, which is actually wider than the original. But if you want to bring in the width, 15, 20%, you can do that. You can just dial it down a little. It doesn't have to necessarily be completely mono. So that's one of the features that, it's not, that one's not completely unique. There are other things that can do similar stuff. But that, again, in combination with the mono recovery, with stereo harmonics generation, really gives you a very powerful kind of all-in-one package that I think is hard to, it's natural. People say, oh, I could do this with this, that, and the other plugin. I don't know anything else that can do the stereo harmonics in the same way. And also just having it all in kind of one package where all the controls are right there at your fingertips and you can see how they all interact, for me, makes it kind of the go-to, obviously.
Okay, yeah. I think that's typically the kind of thing that you would leave up to your mastering engineer, all this really side management.
Exactly.
So I think it's better to not do a high pass on the side than do it randomly.
Right. If it's and I think one of the things is that, especially in the frequencies that we're talking about, those are kind of the hardest areas to get your monitoring really, really accurate and right. So if you can't totally hear what's going on down there, yeah, best not to guess at it. And I certainly with my mastering clients, if something comes in that I think would be better addressed by them, but maybe they haven't heard, I'm always happy to have a conversation with them. And I think most mastering engineers that I know are kind of in the same boat, right? We'd rather have that conversation, and if there's something that can be done at the mix stage to improve upon it, great. But if not, sometimes you get a mix that was printed 10 years ago and you can't get the original mix session back, and this is what you've got to deal with, or whatever the case may be. So at least now there is a tool to do that. But yeah, again, if you can't really hear what's going on down there, certainly don't guess at it.
Yeah. And so this tool is Basslane Pro.
Yeah.
And it's on Tone projects right now. And they already had super plugins like Kelvin and Unisum. You mentioned it. Do you want to add anything else to this interview?
I don't think so. I'll say we did, now that Basslane Pro is part of that, there is a bundle that you could get from Tone Projects for all three, which is like a killer bargain. The discount on all three is great. And I think that's about it.
Nice. And you are a mastering engineer, so people can reach to you.
Yeah.
It's called Flotown Mastering, right?
Yep, exactly. FLOTOWN. And I'm out in the woods in Massachusetts.
Okay, great. And if you come by in Grenoble, in the French Alps, of course, you're welcome.
I'll be sure to. I've been trying to do some more traveling. I took a motorcycle tour of Scotland this fall, so I want to go do more motorcycle tours. Those are a bunch of fun. So if I get to the Alps, I'll certainly give you a call.
Yeah, maybe see you on the road.
Yeah.
That's it. Have a good day, Jan.
You as well. Thank you so much.
Bye.